Okay, everyone, welcome to our second panel. I'm just going to quickly introduce people on the podium here in case any of you don't know who they are. To my immediate right, I have Heather Grabbe, who is the director of Open Society European Policy Institute. She's a former advisor to Olli Rehn when he was the European Commissioner for Enlargement. To her right is Thomas Balasek, who's the director of Carnegie Europe and the former ambassador for Slovakia at NATO. We have Szelényi, I hope I've done honor to pronounced your name correctly, a former Hungarian MP and the co-author of the report's chapter on lifetime. And to her right, we have Dirk Holemans, who is the head of the environmental think tank Oikos, which is based in Brussels. I'm going to kick things off with a question to each, and we'll try and, after that, kind of get a conversation going. And then I'm sure we'll have some time for questions from the floor. So please think about those. Heather, there's a tension in the report. The best examples of how to address planet, lifetime, and technology are often being set at local and city levels. Bologna, Freiburg, Barcelona, Ghent are some of the cities that are mentioned. Yet the message is that leadership in these areas, planet, lifetime, technology, should, to some degree, come from Europe in order to avoid worst-case scenarios, which could include violence in Europe again, which is one of the warnings in the report. So how do we really get the local, in 2 minutes, how do we really get the local and the supranational in sync?
So in the report, we're not setting out a blueprint for this is exactly how it should all work. What we're pointing out is that there are already seeds of progress and points of light across Europe in local initiatives that are highly innovative and which actually work. So the way that energy co-ops, for example, at local level, are providing a huge amount of energy already. And our point about the EU's role is not the EU should do anything, quite the opposite. It's quite clear all of society needs to be involved. It's that the EU should use its convening power to bring together these initiatives, to scale them up, to use its resources, which includes, of course, money and regulation, but which also includes the power to bring together leaders at many different levels, including at local level, to spread the good examples and show it's doable. I mean, this point that Commissioner Vestager made at the very end of the interview about don't make it look so scary. It is actually doable. You can see how it's being done. But that doesn't mean that it's the Commission that should do it all. Quite the opposite. What we want the EU to focus on is what it's good at. What the EU is good at is linking and networking efforts across the European Union at many different levels of governance, this famous system of multi-level governance, providing inspiration, providing best practice, providing standards and templates. And what we don't argue is the EU should do this because it's good for the EU. The EU should do this because it's good for Europeans, because it's good for the future of our society. And that's a very different point of view from the kind of typical debates about the future of the EU, which are all about the institutions. How do we justify the EU? What role should the different institutions play? No, don't start from that. Start from where do we want to be in 2040 and work backwards to what do we need to do now at EU level.
Excellent. Thank you, Heather. Tomasz, I'm going to jump to you again for your opening remarks. On the big issues to do with technology and digital, and I think you played the lead role in the report on those areas, it seems to me that the European Commission and some of the other institutions talk about it all the time. In fact, you could be forgiven for thinking that they'd already solved all the problems. What is really left out there in terms of technology and digital that they need to get onto as a matter of urgency?
Brilliant. Thanks for the question, James. You give me far too much credit. The real technology brains sit in the audience, and you'll have a chance to quiz them for the detailed recommendation.
That's Rina, yes?
At the next, that's Rina and Merle and a few others, and you'll get to speak to them at the next stage of the program in a breakthrough session. So I hope you all stay for that. Look, we give credit where credit is due, and the fact is an awful lot of work, good work, has already been done on the technological issues, a lot of it by the very person who was sitting in this very chair, may have been Zsuzsanna, 5 minutes ago. So we give credit where credit is due, but clearly we wouldn't be writing about technology had we thought that the homework has been done. We see three remaining I also nearly call them low-hanging fruits. They're in fact very difficult, but three remaining issues to be tackled. First, on disinformation. We've not done too badly. We think the East Stratcom, the units that was set up to debunk disinformation, has been very helpful. We think that a number of the guidelines that have been put out have been headed in the right direction. The reality is that the voluntary approach in tackling disinformation, tackling misleading, often very harmful content, has only gotten us so far. Some of the real-world returns from Germany, for example, suggest that in the first year of the German law's existence, a law on illegality of harmful content, only about 1% of it has been removed. So we make a call, controversially perhaps, but we do believe that perhaps if the returns continue to be as poor as they have been so far, perhaps a mandatory requirement may be in place. The second area that we have gotten into is cybersecurity as such. We're not technology Luddites. We don't make the case that technology is bad or is going to make us more vulnerable. We believe that technological revolution is not only given, as the commissioner said, but it's actually a good thing. It'll improve our lives in many important regards. But it's also true that when things are networked, and when they're connected, and when critical infrastructure is networked, you're exposing yourself to some potentially great dangers. The networks that govern healthcare, for example, being attacked in times of crisis. It still is the case that far too many people, far too many IT experts, far too many people responsible for the security of the networks approach security as basically an afterthought. It's too expensive, the alignments or the incentives are misaligned, there's no real financial or criminal penalties for lax protection, and the money that it costs to harden networks is just too high. So we call for realignment of the incentives and the punishments, and basically saying, look, if you are in charge of some of the critical networks, and if you have been criminally lax in a way you protect them, there is a consequence to pay.
So let's expand on that a little later on, because there's so much more to say there. Zsuzsanna, I'm going to turn to you. I'll put the question to you that a large part of this report, in a way, is how to restructure people's expectations about their lifetimes and the arc of their lifetimes. And I'll just throw it in there. I mean, there is some debate about the size of families that people should be having in the future.
Well, one of the greatest inspiration of this report and the report writing process or the discussions beforehand was that we discussed the ultimate political questions, namely how do we want to live in the future and how we want to live together in the future. If you're a politician, this is a question you have to answer every day to the people. It's easier for us to think in policy terms, but basically what people are interested in, how they will live in the future. And politicians do have to tell them what they are ready and able to ease their life. I think that it's very interesting, and I'd like to draw everyone's attention that we use this family here. Because a family is a very important topic in these days in politics, but it's very ideological. And usually we talk about family in a traditional way, or even more traditionalist, populists speak about family, and other people do not. However, family is a basic unit in our life, and if we think about the future, or even if our past, what's important is important for us what happens to our parents and what is happening to our kids. And lastly, also our own life. But this is the most important issue. And I find it fascinating that we could translate all these macro, very abstract issues like climate change into the life of a family. And it's very encouraging for a politician, and this paper offers a lot of wonderful ideas how to think as a politician to offer difficult question reasonable answers. So, of course, we don't know what kind of family form would be great in the future, and we do not want to tell this. We just know that family is important for people, and we also know that states and the European Union and local communities do have a role in people's life and can support them in order to find their own ways. And this is, I think, the core of the approach of this report, and I hope that we could contribute to this with a number of interesting ideas.
Terrific. Thank you, Zsuzsanna. Dirk, you come from the perspective that there's really a lot wrong with today's economy. My question for you is, does this report for you really go far enough, particularly with regard to the ways that we need to help the developing world to develop so they don't repeat the mistakes that we have made, for instance?
First, I think it's important to say that in the report clearly is stated we need another economy. Our economy is taking more from the earth than it can carry. So it's important that the countries in the south, they follow a different path, that they not just first industrialize like we, become a consumer, hyper-consumer society, and then say, oh, we have to become sustainable. And yes, I think that from a point of view of clean technologies, breakthrough technologies, we really have to talk again about not patenting them and putting them behind doors, but how can we make them available, open source almost, to these countries so that they leapfrog. For instance, in Africa, it's clear a lot of sun. They should be building renewable energy systems at once. And there we have to really help them as much as we can. But at the same time, I think we also have to be very careful. We need a lot of new technologies, but technology alone will not solve us, because in our market society, we have the rebound effect. If we do stuff much more efficient, then the danger is we gain money with that, and if we then use it for consumption. So it's about an efficiency, but it's also about working less, consuming less, another picture of what is a good life. Both have to be in the discussion.
Terrific, thank you. I mean, one of the themes that I sort of pick up on all of this is that, I suppose I'd put it this way, a lot of these changes feel like they'll need revolution, not evolution. And the report is all about the plausibility and the ways to do evolution. Another thing that I'm picking up, and again, I think it's related, is that, and it goes to a bit to what Dirk is saying, is that there needs to be a complete rethinking of the way that the liberal market economy, as we have conceived it since the Second World War, operates. Am I right to think that that traditional view of markets and mixed economy needs to really change in ways that we haven't yet grasped? Would anyone like to take that up first? Apart from Dirk.
Dirk will definitely take it up. I just start by observing that markets have their place, and we also have to recognize where markets don't have an incentive, that the market structure is not the right concept, not the right place to make a change happen. And that can be because of several factors. One is where there is no profit motive in the short term, even if there's one in the long term. So how do you incentivize long-term investment? And of course, you can influence the market from the level of the state, and even from the level of the European Union, by changing the tax system, which is why taxes are such an important part of this, on climate, on technology, also on of course, changing the fiscal basis for the welfare state. So changing the government-led public finances also changes things for the market. But where market failure also happens because of the amount of time that's involved. So you talked about revolution, evolution. Revolutions also take a long time. Often the revolutionary moment is just the very beginning, because then you have a very long transition. So the revolution is perhaps when you take the decision, as society as a whole changes direction direction. But then it takes a long time for that to play out. And what we argue is that, yes, there will be a lot of disruption from what is going to happen. That's going to happen, it is happening already. This is not a choice. There is no real choice about climate, tech, and aging populations. They're simply happening. But you can ease it, you can make it less socially disruptive, you can prevent societies going to the wall in political terms and economic terms by planning better, by having pan-European coordination, so having transnational dimension, and by putting in place plans that can survive changes of government. Now, this is a very tricky issue right now in Europe because we need democratic choices about these changes. But what you can't have is a chopping and changing where each government changes policy, because you've got to set in place long-term incentives for this great transition. Just as, think about post-communist transition after 1989, it often took 2, 3, 4, 5 different changes of government before the plans actually were fully implemented and transition was really happening. The same will happen here. And that's again where the European Union has a role in having a consensus at European level about the direction we need to move in. And you also often hear this from market players, from businesses who say, yes, we can cope with this kind of transition. You even hear this sometimes from the energy majors. Just tell us in what direction you're going. Please, government, just give us some certainty that this is going to remain the same policy for the next 20 years, and we will adapt to it. We will make the investments in our business because we know what will be the needs and the benefits, the potential areas of profit for our business in the future. But if the government is constantly wavering and not quite sure, and let's raise the retirement age, oh no, let's take it back down again. Let's phase out fossil fuels. Oh no, but now let's have another 5 years to do it. That's what really causes the problems for the market. I think if the market has a much clearer sense of political direction across Europe, it will adapt and play its role.
Thomas, you wanted to step in on this question.
I did. I wanted to press back slightly against the implication that what we present is revolutionary and therefore somehow, pie in the sky. One of these reports that are wonderful to read. Wouldn't it be nice if this was actually doable? Too bad it isn't, so let me file it away. No, what we propose is a mixed bag. Many of these things the European Union is already seized with. Technology is actually a very good example. The political will to cope with it is there. The follow-up sometimes isn't. So what we're always suggesting is, look, the direction of travel laid out in some of the directives on cybersecurity is spot on. Clearly, again, the political will is already in place. It's just a matter of following up, because what we've tried so far doesn't work. There's another basket of issues that we deal with, which are actually not necessarily complicated in theory, in the sense that they require a change of legislation rather than a change of lifestyle, but the political will isn't there. The basket of issues that Zsuzsa has dealt with eloquently in her lifetime chapter is a good example. We laid out clearly that a tax change may be necessary to lessen the burden away from employing people and actually move some of the tax burden onto resources and resource-intensive modes of production. Now, in theory, this is a very simple thing to do. In practice, the politics, of course, needs to align. So that's sort of the middle-of-the-road issue, one that's technically very easily doable, politically more difficult, but doable. There's a third basket of issues, and I'll be honest, some of them will be difficult. The changes that Dirk is presumably going to return to in a second require change of lifestyle. Let's be honest. Does it mean we ought not to do them? Au contraire. I mean, he lays out a very eloquent case, I think, why there is no alternative. He lays out some of the incentives and disincentives. And the reality is, you've got to start somewhere.
So, fascinating. Zsuzsa, could you perhaps unpack your chapter a little bit, especially about the tax shift? Especially about the way that we're going to shift our systems in order to, for example, cater for people's lifelong learning, and to make sure that these systems are fundable.
Well, what is really interesting, and we learned a lot during writing this report, is that we actually know quite a lot of the future. We do not know enough of climate, and this is really a mystery. And of course, we don't know how people will react, the political consequences. But we can do a lot of design, and we can make a lot of plan, and this is what I think political leadership is about, that we track the future. So what is interesting in the life cycle is that we do a lot of things which are not valued in our current society because they are not paid for. however they create value. Actually, women do more of this kind of job, but men too. So, and we only value things which make money, right? So I think in the idea we put some on this paper is about how to value, how to reward longer term those kind of activities which create value, which are mainly the caring element, but not only family caring, but also kind of society, civil society activities, voluntary work. There are a huge range of things which we are all doing and people are all doing which are not in any way rewarded. So if we could translate it into a system, and that would be wonderful to have a European registry, which we could turn back to, for example, how we tax job and how we tax people, that could be a much more just system, and it could also help to overcome of the different changes in our life cycle. So for example, if we are changing jobs like 5 times in our life, which we are already doing, and probably that will be even more often, there will always a bit of backlash when people won't make money for a couple of months. So if we would have a more global registry, and when we are active, it's like an anti-cyclical activity. I can also say this. I mean, it can come from the economic concept. So we not only accumulate and then use, but we actually, when we produce, and also we produce wealth in non-paid activities, then we could accumulate something that the society rewards. And I think that's something, a new idea, or maybe not that new, but we found it very important to put it into this paper.
One of the wonderful things about this report is that it often identifies the obstacles, the roadblocks to the kind of progress you're describing. And if I could just take up Shusha for one more moment before we get to you, Dirk. One of the things that comes up is that it's Germany standing in the way of a pan-European social insurance system of the sort that I think you were alluding to. So let's say you have German officials in front of you right now. You've got 30 seconds to convince them to change their position.
Well, I am a Central European, and we can be a trouble in Europe in these days. So if I think Germany and German decision makers want to make a more peaceful and stable Europe, which I believe they do, then I think it makes a sense to have a bit more empathy towards other people's, other type of burdens, because then we're just all better off.
Terrific. I think that was 30 seconds.
Okay.
Wow, round of applause for that. That's really terrific. Okay, Dirk, we're coming back to you with what I think all 3 other panelists agreed was perhaps one of the hardest topics, lifestyle. Let's dive into that, but if you want to bring it back to shifting the tax system as well, fair enough. But lifestyle came up, so why don't we start with that?
Well, I will be a bit naughty because I will say we have to be very careful to say people as individuals can change everything with their lifestyle. We need systemic change. And let me say the things that maybe the commissioner was not able to say. She was hinting that we cannot tax our energy-intensive companies, so we pay the taxes. And why can't we pay the energy-intensive companies? Because otherwise they will be competed out by the companies out of China. So what we need to change is we cannot organize everything on a global market. We cannot wait until all continents agree on everything. So we have to make carbon emissions much more expensive. And yes, for our companies to survive, we need a level playing field. What does that mean? This means that if other continents want to import their dirty stuff to us, we get import tariffs. And this money we use to invest, to give to the new technology developers so that our companies can become better and better. Because it's very sad that Anuna could not be here for very good reasons. We really need this sense of urgency. It's not what is doable a little bit within 2 years or 5 years. We only have 10, 12 years. At this very moment in Paris, a report has been communicated about the collapse of biodiversity. So we really have to be very serious about what we can do as the European Union as fast as possible. And yes, that is thinking much larger than what is doable today. We have a commissioner for competition. I would really vote for a commissioner for collaboration within Europe.
Terrific. Heather, let's come back.
Can I just add a point that, I mean, we do have a justice commissioner, but when we say justice, we're often really thinking about civil rights, political rights. But there's now, the huge new movement that Anuna de Wever is part of is about a new kind of justice, and that's intergenerational justice. And that really reframes the issue in a very refreshing and in very important way. Think about the Copenhagen talks on climate, for example, which collapsed, largely because of a fight about justice between rich countries and poor countries, and who should bear the burden. Now, what Anuna and her colleagues in the youth climate movement are saying, hey, this is also about justice between you, the current big hyper-consumers, and we, the future citizens, and our children who will be the citizens after that. And it's not only about Europeans, it's about us, the humans living here on this planet now, and the future inhabitants of this planet, both the humans and the non-humans. So this is really huge. And they have reframed this issue from being primarily a kind of technical issue about how do you set carbon prices and how do you do that, into something, and an international relations issue, into being a moral issue. This is a moral imperative, because the climate is going to heat up regardless of what we do now, because it's already on a trajectory to do that. The death of species, the loss of biodiversity has been massive just in the time since I left school, for example. By the time Anuna leaves school in only 2 years' time, there will be another big loss. It's speeding up incredibly fast. And so there really is no time to mess around with, okay, well, should we really make the burden fall here or there? The burden is going to fall on the current projections on the most vulnerable, the poorest in our societies and the poorest in other societies around the world. If you don't make it just, if you don't bring together climate justice with social justice and think about the moral parts of this argument, not only can you not make the transition happen fast enough, but also we, this current generation of Europeans, will be blamed throughout history for not having taken the action while there was still time to prevent the worst excesses. We are going to suffer, for sure, more than 1 degree of climate change. We are going to suffer extreme weather. There are going to be all kinds of problems. So the question is, do we stop the damage at this point by taking radical action? Do we manage the transitions in all of these different areas well or not? And what worries me about the current debate is we're talking still in very abstract terms when actually it's already very, very concrete.
In fact, it's very interesting to think that, I'll return to this idea that so much is being done on the local level. And Dirk, you're very, this is your interface, this is your daily bread, if you like. You meet these people all the time who are developing technologies in towns and cities to help with a cleaner environment and cleaner skies. I think you call these types of people civil entrepreneurs, and you call the facilitating environment that helps them a partner state. Here, you're really starting to reframe the way the economy works.
I think it's a very interesting and hopeful new given all over the world, but also in Europe, that since 10, 15 years, citizens say we cannot rely anymore on the state or the market. We will take our future into our hands. And it's a very big difference. Let's say with some decades before, some people said, yes, also in the 70s, people did some stuff. Two things are totally different. We have new technologies that allow us to communicate without costs. Secondly, if I go to an evening, people that have established an energy co-op, I have an engineer, a lawyer, a marketeer, and a politician around the table, willing to work together with passion. And so they are able to do amazing stuff. And so all over Europe, we have people coming together, establishing, for instance, energy co-ops, saying we're going to produce our energy ourselves. You have people coming together, say we want local and healthy food. And so this gives this possibility to look at Europe from two different perspectives. You have the one you read in the newspaper, countries not able to work together, a bit sad story. But if you go one layer beyond, you have this vibrant tissue of all initiatives of citizens, and there comes the interesting part. In a lot of local authorities, cities, the politicians are aware of the value, and they say, we will stop with top-down politics. We become a kind of partner state. It's about co-creation. It's about enabling what's already happening, and that can go very fast. And
this is really interesting, and I think this afternoon is becoming a bit of a race to see who can name, create a new commissioner portfolio. So instead of doing that myself, I'll repeat one from the report, which seems to make a lot of sense in terms of what Dirk just said, which is a commissioner for interaction with civil society. I think there was something like that in the report, whereby there would actually be a sort of more, or perhaps it was about being able to access funds more directly, so that some of the ideas that Dirk's referring to can be brought to fruition.
We argue for a fund for local and civic action groups to access at EU level to make these kinds of transitions happen. So, I mean, all of this, there are many, many things that can be done. The question is, once the direction of travel is set, the question is, how do you set that direction of travel and get a consensus at this moment when European politics is highly divisive? We're about to have, in 2 weeks, perhaps the most divisive European Parliament election ever, in which it seems harder and harder to agree on things, because there's been a breaking down of the consensus between the mainstream parties that have dominated politics since the Second World War. But maybe there's also an opportunity here. In addition to the divisive politics driven by populism and anti-everything, anti-establishment, anti-immigrant, etc. movements, maybe there's an opportunity also to say, hey, politics isn't going to work top-down the way it did before, with negotiations among elites which form a consensus which then just gets imposed on society. Let's start with co-creation as the fundamental design principle for EU policies, because then you bring into the debate not just the extremists who grab the headlines because they're anti-things, but also the people who are creating at local level the solutions that could be provided at national and EU level in the future. And if people start to focus on that, if they focus their energy on, okay, this is where we need to go because we can see the problems are huge, then, you become where you put your energy. You become what you focus your attention on. And our societies can focus on that too. If we don't focus on the divisions and all the arguments about migration, but instead see them in the perspective of, hey, over the next 20 years, we are going to have to deal with these massive challenges together because they're going to affect all of us. How do we do this in a just way and an efficient way? Then you can bring to the table all the people who are quietly getting on with making those transitions at local level, who aren't getting the headlines. I mean, get journalists to really write about those and to think about spreading the many, many points of light that there are in Europe. It's not just darkness and misery, quite the opposite. There's actually a lot of points of light in local politics, and I hope that that's what can come after the European Parliament elections for the next term of the institutions.
Thanks, Heather. Before we come back to you, Thomas, on tech, I just wanted to go back to you, Zsuzsanna. There are all of these experiments. This is another very interesting part of the report. There are all these experiments, universal basic income, other ways of reconfiguring, the way that we deal with citizens when they're in between periods, in between jobs. One of the really interesting things about this report is what happens if we get that wrong. Now, I don't want to,
No.
But it's
You
very
don't.
okay.
Politics is taking risk. Is about that. I didn't know that so well 25 years ago. It's very clear now, but I think it was always like this. So political leadership is about seeing far, taking the initiative, even if you are not completely aware of every details, you are not sure whether you will make the good thing or not. You make a try, and if you don't, then you correct yourself. But risk-taking is a very important element in politics. It's good politician is courageous. I think this is very much missing now in Europe. This is part of our problem, that our politicians are not very careful, not courageous enough. And I think this is because of we know that we will have less in the future, and we want to survive. So what I learned in Hungarian politics in the last couple of years is there's a huge difference of how you see things. Whether you want to survive whatever you already have, or you know that things are going to be different, and you see it as an opportunity, and you take a risk, and you will manage. Most of the time, risk takers are more successful than the ones who just want to survive. So this is what I take as a politician as a basic attitude, and this is what I think we would be all more successful if there would be a bit more risk-taking.
And indeed, if we don't get that right, there could be what some countries, some member states called social dumping, where you have some member states that attract other people because their home countries have not done enough to address the issues that we're talking about here. And in a way, that should be pushing us to take, if I've understood you correctly, take the risks now.
Well, we have to make reasonable risks, so obviously, but yes. So I think the European Union and the free flow of people is now so intensive, and the next generation will be even more, especially if we hopefully offer them all the train tickets and Erasmus and meeting already school children to other school children. So this will be a much more equal access for every future European citizen to move around. So now we are speaking about social dumping in jobs, but of course, social environment can also create social dumping. And this is exactly why we need a more coherent social European approach to life.
Right, because if one state has universal basic income and another one doesn't, you create pull effects.
Right.
And then everybody turns against Europe and blames Europe again. So in a way, you do need this kind of harmonized approach to make the future work.
We have to be very smart to do that, because of course our countries have different level of living standard. So it's not a little challenge, it's a big challenge. But if we know that we have to do it, because then we will eliminate certain risks in the future or challenges, then we will be able to do that.
Okay, now Thomas, one of the another fascinating part of this report is the way that it argues that the breakdown of our trust in technology, our trust in the way that we used to get information is creating a very, very vicious cycle, leading to more disengagement, more cynicism, and again, perhaps a push to the political extremes. You lay out in the technology chapter, or your colleagues do, how we can break that cycle, which is just so negative. Perhaps you can take us a little bit into that, just to give us some optimism.
Happy to, James. We spent a lot of time talking about how disinformation and a breakdown in the traditional information flows has weakened democracy. Before I go into the case, let me also state clearly we're not claiming that technology is what brought broad populists to power. Clearly, a lot has gone wrong with our democracies that has nothing to do with technology, and it's all about things like intergenerational justice, other forms of justice, and so forth. But it is, to state the obvious, the case that when you have these information ghettos, bubbles, whatever you call them, some of the fundamentals of democracy start to creak or break down. Democracy assumes that people make informed choices about their elected representatives, which presumes that they get reasonably objective information about how they perform, which presumes that there is an enlightened, at least an educated debate or intelligent debate among the different schools of thought, because performance is in many ways in the eyes of the beholder. So you expect it to have an intelligent debate among the different political parties. But if everybody retreats into these isolated information ghettos, is my preferred words, because I think it's actually more accurate than bubbles, then the entire process starts breaking down. What we point out in the report is that the solutions are a bit more complicated than creating a debunking or myth-busting websites, as useful as that is. In some ways, the solution starts at a very early age, raising and educating children with an eye on critical thinking. It is the failure to think critically about the stuff that pops up on your Instagram, Twitter, Facebook or Google. That's, if you will, the original sin, because half the time if you simply paused and thought about the merits and the wisdom of what's being served to you, you would probably go, wait a minute, this just doesn't sound right. So we address the need for critical education. We talk about the need, and I see independent journalists in the room, we talk about the need to strengthen independent journalism. Part of the reason why you have the disinformation reaching such pervasive levels is that what is the quality journalism, the independent journalism, a lot of the quality Wall Street journals and others, where is Valentina? They have retreated behind paywalls for a number of reasons, because it's, you got to pay the bills one way or another, which means that the other stuff that's out there, a lot less credible, often not vetted at all, has remained free and therefore more attractive to people who are understandably reluctant to pay for a subscription. So we got to do with the economics of the business at all, because you're not going to get people to read more quality information if it simply costs so much more.
And how does that model look? What is that model for building a public sphere that is a healthy one, that prizes accuracy and facts, and that disintermediates the highly addictive environment of Instagram and Facebook?
Well, part of it is, again, leveling the playing field financially. We believe actual financial support for independent journalism may well be part of the, may well be a necessary part of the answer. Part of it is, and I like to think, again, we're not social engineers. We don't propose that every single one of the changes is going to require concerted action as laid out in this report. In number of realms, good things are already happening. There's some indications that there is, if you will, a rebound among in interest in proper quality journalism. An indication from Reuters Institute that readership in paid mainstream media has gone up recently as people begin to realize that what they are served on a lot of the free newspapers and a lot of the free websites is actually junk for all purposes. So we're not pretending to need to start a revolution. We actually believe there is a positive change afoot, slowly but surely. But there are ways you can speed it up. There are ways you can incentivize it, again, for example, by giving more financial support to independent journalists.
And just to pin you down on what you said in your introductory remarks, what we have right now is a voluntary code of practice between a lot of governments, but in particular the European Commission and the social platforms, when it comes to taking down hate speech and to what are essentially political lies.
Yeah.
This is voluntary for the moment, and you're personally, but perhaps in the report also, opening that up and saying, look, if this is not working out and we see the democratic conversation becoming more and more blunted and obscured, then there's room for regulation in this area, which is very, very tough stuff.
It is, and it's a great question because it allows me to make another broader point, which is that we don't believe in regulation and directives for directives' sake. So the exact wording we use is, should voluntary approach not work out, we ought to be ready for actually mandatory approach or mandatory requirements to remove first harmful, then possibly also misleading context, those being two slightly different things. The emphasis isn't on directives and new legislation at any cost, by any sake. We very much draw the line. The reality, though, is, again, that this is still early days, but the actual real-life returns on the voluntary codes are pretty poor. The amount of legislation, the one that I cited already, the amount of harmful content that's been removed on the basis of voluntary approach has been pitiful. The European Commission itself, in its communiques, recognizes the need for vigilance and watching what the early and what the eventual results will be, leaving room for the possibility that a mandatory approach will be required. And again, we don't believe in legislation for legislation's sake, but where you clearly have a failure of the voluntary approach, that's where we think that the legal arm ought to step in.
And this is not just about the supply side of the people who are producing content or pushing it at the public. It's about the demand side, because it's really hard to regulate fake news and disinformation, as we're discovering through different attempts at national level. But the demand side is having resilient citizens who are fully empowered to make their own decisions, to think critically about what they're receiving and what they want to buy in terms of services, and buying both in monetary terms, but also being prepared to give their data. So our avatar, Claudia, for example, on her 21st birthday in 2040, which you see over there on that last panel, one of the things that she's doing in her own life is not only being a good user of online material because she's fully aware of where it comes from and how to judge reputation and so on, but she teaches digital hygiene in a primary school, and she's also part of a civic initiative to monitor the safety and security of critical infrastructure for her own neighborhood. So this is a really active, empowered citizen who is not a passive taker of the content pushed to her by platforms or by what the state puts on her as a citizen. She is herself co-creating it. So the whole idea of this is you can't necessarily control everything that happens in the information environment. In fact, you wouldn't want that. As Karl Popper said, an open society is one in which no one person has a monopoly on the truth. But in a society as now, where there are multiple truths, plenty of alternative truths floating around, it's actually the citizen as a resilient, empowered, intelligent, and very knowledgeable consumer of this and co-creator of that kind of information who is the best unit to ensure that we can keep our societies open.
Terrific. Yeah, follow up.
Just really quickly, I want to address the definitional problem, James, that you alluded to. The fact that it's hard to legislate if people disagree on what is harmful or what is misleading. We don't run away from that argument. What we argue is that if you are going to have a process leading to legislation that makes either harmful or misleading content, or makes it mandatory to remove either harmful or misleading content, that needs to be preceded by a debate that tightens the understanding of what is what. This is not the case to approach to adopt the approach of a famous U.S. senator who once thundered, "I'll recognize pornography when I see it." Now we call for a somewhat tighter conversation, because the reality is that once you start legislating without first having a discussion on what is harmful and what is misleading, you raise the opportunities, you create the opportunities for gaming the system in a way that it wasn't intended. You start seeing websites being taken offline, which are actually perfectly legit, simply because somebody else has gamed the system. So the one has to precede the other. The definitional debate first, and then the legislation if the voluntary approach hasn't worked out.
Yes, I think that's a prerequisite for buying in, especially some of the mainstream, very large media houses who are not going to, they're going to push back against that. Now, we've got a good 14, 15 minutes left. Can I just have a quick show of hands as to how many people might have questions for our amazing panel? Good, quite a few. So let's get straight to that if everyone's okay with that on the panel. We had a woman just there. I'm sorry to point, but yes. If you could just introduce yourself and yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name is Marisol. I'm a student in Sciences Po. I have a question because we talked about the need for a new economy. I was thinking, how do we get big industries that base their income and success on the social need for consumption to be on board with actually reducing consumption? And particularly, what would be the role of the EU on getting them there?
I think it's quite simple. You have to develop guidelines and a frame for a circular economy in which you state that everything you made is durable, is repairable, and you can disassemble. And that's also a business case. So we think we have a circular economy of this moment, but the sad thing is that, for instance, a lot of our computers, they end up in a dump site in Ghana. So we don't have at this moment a circular economy because there are escape roads. So we make companies responsible for what they make, from the eco-design, how it is made, to the end of life, cradle to cradle. And then I would say, these big companies, they are very smart. It's up to them to develop new business models that fit in within the planetary boundaries.
Terrific. Thank you. Good? Okay. Yes, young lady there.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Magda Kufrey. I work for the European Commission. And thank you very much for this very interesting debate with many different points for reflection for, I think, all of us. I have a few that I wanted to check with you what you think about that. So first of all, about changing lifestyle. You've been talking a little bit about those grassroots communities, people who try to change things by themselves without authorities telling them that they have to do it. But what's your opinion about having some kind of like top-down approach in certain fields? We see it, for example, now the EU banned the use of plastic. I come from Poland myself. To be fair, I think that, for example, in my country, if it wasn't banned by authorities, people would be just using it. So just a question of like, how much do you think authorities, the government, the EU can go into telling people what to do in order to force a change in lifestyle in the next, let's say, 20 years?
I mean, in some ways, the report is all about how to get beyond the very problem that you identify there. Who would like to come back to Magda on that one?
Well, I think that it's not everything the EU should do, right? I think this whole partner state idea is more than in that. It's that we have several actors who are defining our future, including ourselves. So it's the individuals, it's communities, it's regions, it's states, it's intergovernmental organization, it's the European Union. So your story with banning plastic in Poland, and I'm from Hungary, so I can understand this very well. It's of course a problem because before such a decision should be discussed in a different level what prosperity means, which actually another most important question. What prosperity means for us? What would this mean in the future? We don't have to start right away that we will have less and we have to consume less, because of course that's not a very smart strategy. But already there's a lot of changes happening. People value more their health. We all know that they spend much more on health, on sport, on going out and walk, and there is a lot of activities now. So actually this changes what a good life means, whether we are only shopping or we are doing all kind of other things, spending more time together with the people who we like, who are close to us. I mean, these are all part of, I think we have to do it more consciously, and the plastic ban banning story is a part of this discussion, and more people are responsible for this than just the European Union. But of course, this is also true for the EU decision makers, how to introduce such a new directive. So what should be the narrative, the storytelling? The storytelling is important for the European Union, and you are right that this is often missing.
So I don't want to neglect this side of the room. I saw that hand first, and then over to you. So this one first.
Zsuzsanna, working for the Committee of the Regions, so a lot of what you're saying about the role of local authorities is, of course, music to our ears. But I wanted to push you a bit further on the boring aspect of governance, but since we are in Brussels, I guess we can talk about that as well. Because you talked a lot about, like the previous question also mentioned, the self-organizing and self-entrepreneurship of citizens, and then you talk about the role of the European level. So how do you connect these two closer together? Do you have any thoughts? I understand the report tries very hard not to be prescriptive, but do you have ideas on new forms of democracy to get that going? Because we've seen that giving people binary choices on very complex issues, speaking Brexit, didn't work very well. So other ideas for new forms of direct democracy?
I found, I won't speak for the panelists, but there was very interesting stuff alluded to in the report about what do we do with technology and democracy. But Dirk, I think you wanted to jump in first. Was I right about that?
Well, I always look at Europe as a kind of lasagna with different layers. And so we think Europe is the top layer that only should deal with the layer below, the member states. So I think we have to mix more the lasagna and direct interaction between European Union and the lower levels. And there's one fantastic example. It's on a voluntary base, what is proposed for mayors to engage on climate policy. And it really works very well. you see a lot of mayors or at the local level saying, yes, we want to embrace this bold climate policy with goals much more ambitious than the European Union. And so this Convenant of Mayors is a very good example how by challenging the local level, you have this interaction between the top and the bottom of the lasagna. And so if you could add there more money, more incentive money, I think this could be a really tasteful recipe for good politics.
Vegan lasagna. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Now, this question of technology and democracy. If I can just expand on your question briefly, I mean, some people. I mean, if you speak to the 5-Star Movement, they'll talk about how we're going to use our telephones to vote on everything.
But it's more complicated than that. As we found out, some of us especially closely, referendums are not a great method for complex questions. And one of the things that the Reformists looked at in quite a lot of detail was how do you use citizens' initiatives? How do you connect these two things? And the technology is just really part of the answer. Some of our Reformists who are here today and who will be speaking in the galleries of the Beaux-Arts in the next session have themselves been involved in local initiatives that connect directly to EU level, either because through EU funding and their feedback to the EU institutions, they're actually providing data and important feedback on what works at local level, or they've been involved in gathering information from citizens and trying out different kinds of deliberative forums. I think citizens' consultations that's not the only way of doing things. There's also all kinds of deliberative democracy, which allows very complex issues to be discussed with real expertise in the room, where citizens can make informed choices and can then go out and actually talk in their own communities about these things. So we've got people in the Reformist group who have themselves personal experience of actually doing this in various places in Europe. So please come and talk to them about that. And of course, this is nothing new. As you'll see in the Bernard Finoli paintings, you see citizens discussing issues, even under monarchies, the Habsburgs, indeed empires, in the past. This is what citizens have always done. The question is, how do you make that more transparent, more evident how it's done, and make it clear to citizens that their input is actually being used. It's not just, oh yes, well, so you voted and we'll come back to you in 5 years' time. No, this is something that citizens, because of their experience online as consumers and as involved in online fora, they're expecting interactive feedback from levels of government all the time. So the demand is there. The question is how to do that connection.
Right. Terrific. And there was a gentleman there.
Good afternoon, Stephen Everett. I work at the External Action Service. Very inspired by the report and today's discussion, because it's really great that this group is obliging us to rethink totally the agenda and to start at a different end and to rethink our economic model, democratic model. All of it is fantastic, and we hear a lot of great examples also from local initiatives, citizens, mayors. The thing I don't hear about is the rest of the world, because we're still a little bit pretending that, you know, we're going to build this perfect society in Europe and we're going to do it all together and differently, and that's all great and exciting. And we're, you know, dreaming up new tasks for the European commissioners and portfolios. But I don't hear about the Asian progressives or the African progressives, because I don't think on our own, Europe, we're going to solve climate change or technology, get a fix on the big tech giants. And I think that world is gone too, that Europe on its own was going to do it. But my point is, we don't have to do it alone, because there are progressives in Asia, there are progressives in Africa and elsewhere around the world that also are rethinking these things. So can I invite the great minds on the panel to talk about the global progressives? Thank you.
Who would like to begin?
I can kick it off, and I'm sure Heather, Dirk, and Zsuzsanna will want to add things. Thanks for pointing it out, Stephen. We don't propose to have open and closed all the debates to you know, down to the last dot and the last comma and point. The reality is we leave what we set out. We set out with an ambition to refocus the EU, to cast a lot more attention on these issues, and we actually leave it to you, and hope that many of you will actually point out what are the things within this space, dealing with these three big generational changes that need to be done that we haven't pointed out. If we have more of a conversation of the sort that we've just heard from you, we will have in some ways already succeeded. So what's continuing and taking up the challenge? We don't quite completely shirk away from the debate on a global role. We point out on climate change, first and foremost, obviously, there's no such thing as a European solution alone. But that doesn't mean that we cannot start leading by example. And Dirk was absolutely right. There are some issues where, frankly, if the rest of the world doesn't follow, that doesn't mean that we ought to shirk away from leading by example ourselves. We point out in quite an actual elaborate detail, this is Heather, I mean, declare who the author is. She's done a fantastic job, I thought, at the beginning, laying out why is it that the EU has almost a unique ability to inspire others. The fact that we have a somewhat of a better reputation for doing things for altruistic reasons, being able to separate economic interest from some of the bigger global interests involved, and therefore we may be able to inspire where others may not be. And lastly, frankly, we have no choice but to hope and inspire on a lot of these things simply because nobody else is doing the work. And we wish in many ways that this debate didn't have to take place because a combined US-Chinese leadership on climate change has rendered this entire debate moot. It just isn't happening. So in many regards, as difficult as it will be and as limited as EU action, whether it's by example or failing there alone, as limited as it is by definition, the reality is nobody else is doing it. We may have to.
And everybody on this planet is facing these three big challenges. China is facing a huge demographic crisis because it has a very skewed demographic, which will be where an aging population is going to be a huge issue for many more Chinese than there are Europeans. The US is already being hit by the extreme weather patterns associated with climate change. We can see the way that tech is changing every society at all kinds of levels. In Africa, for example, tech is having an enormous impact on traditional societies and also on the big cities. So these are not problems that are unique to Europe. What could be unique is that Europe finds some of the solutions and that these can be applied at the level of Chinese cities, which are already interested in some of the European level solutions. We can also learn from them and team up with them. And that's the other factor that we used to be used to, yes, transatlantic leadership. Okay, that's in a pretty sorry state at the moment, for good reasons, actually. I think there's no reason to cooperate with the US government on some of these issues that would just lead to us compromising our position in the wrong direction. But we can work with California. We can work with the many progressive Americans who are deeply worried about these issues, which also face the US. A little bit less aging population, but they have other demographic problems. And so it's possible to team up with the progressives in many different parts of the world. And I think, again, to come back to the youth climate activists, they are also there in other countries. And the great thing about youth climate activists is they've discovered the ultimate teenage rebellion subject. Blame the elders for having failed to take the responsibility which we are going to have to pay for. This is ideal, and this works in every society, whether it's authoritarian or democratic, whether it's mainly a gerontocratic communist party that's in charge, or it's a gerontocratic something else like we kind of have here. This is an ideal issue. So let's use that energy, and that energy is there, and so now is the moment to link it up.
Terrific. Zsuzsanna, did you want to add a point?
Just to emphasize, but basically what Heather studied. So our aim with this paper was to concentrate on Europe, so that we didn't have large ambition. And we also live in a very competitive global world. And there is a lot of resentment in some other continents. So it's not so. I think we are not that idealistic, believing that the whole world is coming together and we will solve the big problems, because actually things do not look like this in these days, and probably never. But that's very true that we do have allies everywhere else, and we have to find them, and you probably can help doing this with the external service to find, and also at NGO level and at European level, and basically everywhere we can find them.
Fantastic. So we're at 5 p.m. So I'm sorry if there were any other burning questions, but there is going to be an opportunity to ask whatever you want of the entire group of reformists if you join them upstairs for the Bernard van Orley art exhibition.
So you have an opportunity not only to see the exhibition for free, thank you Beaux-Arts, but to also see how the themes which are there in the tapestries and the paintings and the stained glass of Van Orley of the 16th century and how they resonate today. The reformists will be there. There'll be 2 reformists per artwork to talk in detail about their own experiences, their own background on all of this, which is beyond even what you've heard on this panel. panel. So you can join for a little while, you can join for the whole session and then join us for a drink and something to eat afterwards as well, or you can just come to the first part when you'll hear about the artwork.
Terrific, thanks. Can we have a round of applause for our panel?